The dining room was full that night, the long wooden table crowded with plates of jollof rice, fried plantain, and steaming bowls of goat meat pepper soup. Relatives and friends of the family filled every chair, their voices loud with laughter and gossip. Amina sat quietly at the far end, picking slowly at her food, her presence barely noticed. Her father, Chief Tund, was at the head of the table, dressed in a crisp agbada, the air of authority never leaving him. The conversation shifted toward the children, their achievements, and their futures. One of Amina's cousins spoke proudly about his new job, and the table clapped. Then Chief Tund's eyes landed on his daughter. His voice cut through the noise, sharp and heavy. Look at Amina. She has always been useless. She will never amount to anything. Mark my words, she will die poor. The words hung in the air like smoke. A pause, then laughter erupted around the table. Some laughed nervously, others openly. A cousin smirked, an aunt covered her mouth but could not hide her grin. Each laugh felt like a slap to Amina's face. She lowered her gaze, her spoon frozen above her plate. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Silent tears slipped down her cheeks, quickly wiped away before anyone could see too much. But behind those tears, her eyes carried something her father didn't notice, a quiet fire. In that moment, she promised herself his words would not be the end of her story. From the time Amina was a teenager, she had been hustling. While other girls her age were busy buying new clothes and talking about parties, she was walking under the hot Lagos sun, selling recharge cards on the roadside. Sometimes she carried trays of puff puff to hawk in traffic, dodging angry drivers and police officers who shouted at street sellers. It was never easy, but she always told herself, one day this struggle will mean something. After secondary school, she tried her first small business, making Ankara handbags. She saved money to buy fabric, stitched the bags by hand, and carried them from office to office, begging people to buy. Some smiled politely and turned her away. Others bought out of pity. The little profit she made disappeared quickly. When she couldn't keep up with costs, the business collapsed. Her father used that failure to mock her. I told you, you don't have sense for business. You are wasting your time, he would say, shaking his head as though she were a stranger and not his daughter. Each word cut deep, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of breaking down in front of him. She moved on to another idea, catering small events with her friend. They cooked in smoky kitchens, staying up all night to prepare food. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. One wedding they catered ended in disaster when the jollof rice burned, and the guests complained loudly. Her father laughed so hard when he heard about it, telling anyone who cared to listen that his daughter could not even cook rice properly. Yet in those quiet moments, when the world called her a failure, her mother would slip into her room. Mama never had the courage to defend her openly in front of Chief Tund, but she would place a gentle hand on Amina's shoulder and whisper, "Don't give up. You are stronger than you know." Those words stayed with her more than the insults did. Through every setback, Amina's inner voice grew louder. I am not useless. Failure is not the end. Each mistake is teaching me something. One day they will see. She took every odd job she could find, cleaning offices, tutoring children, selling second-hand clothes in Balagan Market. People laughed at her stubbornness, but she kept going. Every time she was pushed down, she forced herself to rise again. Her father's harsh words became like fuel, painful but burning inside her, keeping her restless and hungry. She began to dream bigger, scribbling business ideas in old notebooks, teaching herself new skills on borrowed computers at cybercafe. She didn't know when or how, but she believed with all her heart that she would one day prove everyone. The road was full of struggle, but Amina refused to let her story end in failure. Inside her, determination was quietly building into something no insult could kill. The compound was alive with music that night, drums and high-life songs spilling into the streets. Bright lights hung across the walls, and the smell of roasted suya and grilled fish filled the air. Cars lined the road outside, shiny SUVs and sedans, all belonging to the important guests who had come to celebrate Chief Tund's son. Inside the house, the living room looked like a palace. Expensive wine bottles stood on every table, and waiters moved around with trays of small chops. Guests laughed loudly, praising Chief Tund for raising such successful children. One brother had just been promoted in a big oil company. Another had returned from abroad with a master's degree. Their father's chest swelled with pride as he introduced them one by one, boasting about their achievements like trophies. Then came the silence that always seemed to follow whenever it was time to mention Amina. Chief Tund didn't even hide his disdain. And this one, he said with a smirk pointing toward her, still chasing dreams that cannot feed her. A poor dreamer. At her age, she has nothing to show. The room erupted in laughter. Some guests shook their heads in pity, others chuckled openly. One uncle leaned toward her and said, half joking, maybe you should find a rich husband. At least then you won't starve. Her brothers smirked, enjoying the attention, while her father nodded as though mocking her was part of the celebration. Amina sat quietly in her simple dress, feeling the weight of every eye on her. She didn't argue, didn't beg for respect. Her hands tightened around her bag, her eyes steady though her heart ached. The laughter stung, but she refused to let them see her break. When the music rose again and the crowd turned back to eating and drinking, she stood up slowly. Nobody noticed at first. She slipped out of the room, her footsteps light against the tiled floor, her head held high. The noise of the party faded behind her as she walked into the night. She paused at the gate, looking back at the glowing compound where her father basked in glory and her brothers enjoyed praise. For a moment, tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. Inside her, something stronger was stirring. They could laugh now. They could call her a poor dreamer. But what they didn't know was that she already had a plan she had been shaping quietly, in notebooks filled with sketches, in sleepless nights spent researching at cybercafes, in conversations with people who believed in her vision. As she walked away from the noise and into the cool Lagos night, her steps grew firmer. She wasn't leaving in shame. She was leaving with fire in her heart and a secret promise to herself. The next time they spoke her name, it would not be as a joke. It would be as the one who proved them all wrong. The sun had barely risen when Amina boarded the early flight from Lagos to Abuja. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She sat by the window, clutching the folder that held her pitch notes. The night before, she had walked away from her father's party full of shame, but now she was carrying something far more powerful: her dream, her plan, her chance. By the time she arrived at the sleek glass building where the meeting was set, her palms were sweating. She paused at the door, whispering to herself, "Breathe, Amina. This is your moment." She straightened her simple blazer, pushed the door open, and walked into the boardroom. Inside, four investors sat around a polished table, their suits sharp, their eyes curious but distant. They had seen hundreds of young entrepreneurs before, most with big talk but little substance. Amina felt the weight of their gaze. Her knees trembled under the table, but she forced a smile and began. Her voice shook at first as she explained her tech startup idea, a digital platform designed to connect small businesses in Nigeria with global buyers. But as she spoke, her nerves melted into passion. She talked about the women she had met in markets, carrying brilliant handmade goods, but struggling to sell beyond their stalls. She spoke about her vision to give them a platform, to turn local hustlers into international entrepreneurs. The investors leaned forward. One of them interrupted with a tough question about competition. Amina swallowed hard, then answered with quiet confidence, drawing from the years of failure that had taught her resilience. She explained how she had studied what others were missing, how she planned to make her platform not just another app, but a lifeline for those ignored by bigger players. Another investor asked how she planned to handle setbacks. Amina smiled softly, almost remembering her father's cruel words. "Setbacks have been my teacher," she said. "I've failed many times, but each failure shaped this idea. I know how to fall and rise again. That's why I believe this will work." The room grew still. For the first time, their faces softened. They weren't just hearing a pitch. They were hearing her story, her hunger, her scars, her strength. One of them exchanged a glance with the others, nodding slightly. By the time she finished, Amina's fear had transformed into fire. She looked at each of them directly, her voice calm but fierce. "This is not just about business," she said. "It's about giving people like me, people written off as nothing, a chance to be something." Silence followed, but it was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of minds being moved. One investor leaned back, smiling for the first time. "You've been through the storm," he said, "and you still believe. That's rare." Amina walked out of that boardroom with no promises yet, but with hope heavy in her chest. For the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. 2 days after the pitch, Amina sat in a tiny hotel room in Abuja, her laptop open on the bed. She had been refreshing her email every hour, waiting, praying, hoping for something. Each time the inbox stayed empty, her heart sank a little. She told herself not to expect too much. She had faced rejection too many times to count. Still, a small flame of hope refused to die inside her. That afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip, her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She almost ignored it, thinking it was another spam message. But when she glanced at the subject line, her breath caught. "Congratulations, partnership approval." Her fingers shook as she clicked it open. The words blurred for a moment as her eyes filled with tears. The international firm she had pitched to had not only accepted her proposal, they were offering her a contract worth $50 million. $50 million. For a few seconds, she sat frozen, staring at the screen as though it might vanish. Then the reality hit her like a wave. She screamed, a raw sound of disbelief, laughter, and tears all mixed together. She fell to her knees on the thin carpet floor, covering her face with her hand. The memories of her father's words from the party rushed back, the mocking laughter, the guests calling her a poor dreamer. She remembered how small she had felt at that table, how heavy her tears had been. Now those same tears returned, but this time they were full of joy. She whispered a shaky prayer, thanking God for not letting her pain be wasted. She thought of her mother's quiet voice, telling her not to give up. Mama had been right. She was stronger than she knew. Amina stood and paced the room, laughing and crying at the same time. She picked up the contract papers they had attached and pressed them to her chest. $50 million. It felt unreal, like a dream she wasn't ready to wake up from. She imagined her father's face when he would hear the news, the same man who had looked her in the eye and declared she would die poor. For years, he had called her useless. Now, she held proof in her hands that she was anything but. The girl who had once hawked puff puff in traffic, who had burned rice at catering jobs, who had been laughed out of family dinners, she had done it. The world was about to know her name, not as a failure, but as a fighter who turned rejection into triumph. That night, as she lay in bed, the contract printed and neatly placed beside her, Amina couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face, the laughter of her relatives, the shame she had carried for years. But this time the image didn't break her. It fueled her. Tomorrow she would go home. And tomorrow, everything would change. When Amina's car pulled into the family compound, the same house where she had been mocked so many times, the air was filled with the sound of chatter and laughter. It was another evening of gathering, relatives visiting, neighbors dropping by, children running around. From outside, she could already hear voices drifting through the windows, and her name was there, twisted in the usual jokes. "Ah, Amina the dreamer," one uncle said loudly, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "She must be planning another business that will fail again." A burst of laughter followed. Another relative added, "Maybe she should open a shop selling excuses. At least she will never run out of stock." The words cut, but not like before. This time, Amina walked slowly, gracefully, her steps steady, her face calm. She wore a simple white dress, her hair tied neatly back, and carried a small leather folder tucked under her arm. Nothing about her shouted success, and maybe that was why nobody paid her much attention at first. When she stepped into the living room, the conversations hushed for a moment. Then the whispers started again. Some cousins exchanged smirks. Others looked her up and down as though waiting to find something to mock. Her brothers, sitting tall beside their father, barely nodded at her. Chief Tund, dressed in another fine agbada, raised his chin. He didn't speak, but his eyes carried the same judgment they always did, disappointment mixed with pride for everyone except her. Amina didn't rush to explain herself. She didn't fling the folder onto the table or announce her news in a burst of excitement. Instead, she greeted everyone softly, her voice calm, her smile steady. She took a seat in the corner of the room, listening. The gossip around her flowed easily. They talked about money, jobs, contracts. Every so often, someone would throw in a jab about her. "Amina, when will you bring us good news, eh?" an aunt teased, shaking her head. "Your brothers are shining. You are still chasing shadows." More laughter, more whispers. But Amina sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her folders still closed. Inside her chest, her heart was racing, but on her face, not a flicker showed. She wanted this moment to stretch, to let them speak freely, to let them believe their words still held power. Her mother glanced at her from across the room, worry etched in her eye. But when she saw the calmness in her daughter's face, something like relief softened her expression. She knew her child well enough to sense that something was coming. And Amina waited. She let the gossip rise and fall, let the laughter echo, let her father's silence stand like a wall. She knew the right moment would come, and when it did, she would speak only once. Until then, she sat quietly, carrying the weight of her secret like a crown only she could feel. The laughter in the living room was still going strong when Amina finally moved. She sat up straighter, her hands sliding over the small leather folder on. The sound of voices around her felt far away now, like the world had gone quiet inside her. She rose slowly to her feet. A few people glanced at her, curious, but most continued their conversations. "Excuse me," she said softly, but her voice carried. The room stilled. Maybe it was the calmness in her tone, or maybe it was the way she stood, tall and steady, as though nothing could shake her. All eyes turned toward her. Chief Tund leaned back in his chair, frowning, his expression already annoyed. "What is it this time, Amina? Another idea? Another excuse?" His words drew chuckles from the guests, but Amina didn't flinch. Instead, she opened the folder slowly, deliberately, as though unwrapping something priceless. She pulled out several crisp documents stamped with bold international seals. Holding them carefully, she began to read aloud. Her voice was steady, clear. She read the opening lines of the partnership agreement, the name of the international firm, and the figure written in black and white, $50 million. The room went silent, the kind of silence that presses on the skin heavy and unshakable. No one laughed this time. No one dared to breathe too loudly. A cousin who had been smirking earlier blinked, his mouth slightly open. An aunt shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around her cup. Even the children sensed something was different and stopped their playful noise. Amina lifted her eyes from the papers and let her gaze sweep across the room. "This," she said firmly, "is the contract for my company. We have secured a deal worth $50 million with an international partner." Gasps echoed around her. Someone muttered, "50 million?" As though the number itself was too heavy to carry. Heads turned sharply toward Chief Tund, waiting for his reaction. The great chief, who had always been quick to boast about his sons and mock his daughter, sat frozen. His proud face cracked, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes flickering in disbelief. Shame crept into the corners of his expression, though he tried to hide it behind a stiff frown. Guests began whispering to each other, their voices low but loud enough to be heard. So she was the successful one all along. Imagine, after all the insults. Amina, the useless one, has brought home $50 million. Amina didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or smile triumphantly. She simply closed the folder and held it to her chest. Her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. In that silence, her father's pride turned into something else. Regret, shame, maybe even fear. And for the first time in her life, Amina was not the one sitting small in the... She was the one standing tall in the center, while everyone else was left speechless. The room stayed frozen long after Amina's words faded. The only sound was the slow ticking of the wall clock. Everyone's eyes shifted to Chief Tund, waiting, almost holding their breath. He was the man who always had something to say, the man whose voice drowned out everyone else's. But now he sat still, his lips parted slightly, his face pale beneath the weight of silence. For once, Chief Tund had no words. Neighbors and relatives exchanged glances, their whispers spreading like fire. "Did you hear that? $50 million, one muttered. "So it's true. Amina is the one who made it." Another shook her head, almost in disbelief. After all the insults her father gave her? Look at her now. The same people who had laughed at her just minutes ago now looked at her with wide eyes full of respect, even awe. An uncle who had mocked her as a dreamer leaned forward, nodding quickly as though trying to align himself with her success. An aunt who once dismissed her smiled nervously, clapping her hands softly. Chief Tund finally cleared his throat, trying to recover. "And well," he began, his voice lower than usual. "It is good, very good. But we should not exaggerate. These things, sometimes they look bigger on paper than in reality." His attempt to downplay the news sounded weak, unconvincing. Nobody bought it. The documents were real. The figure was undeniable, and the confidence in Amina's voice had left no room for doubt. The whispers grew louder, now aimed at him. So this is the daughter he called useless? After all the disgrace, she is the one carrying the family name higher than anyone. Some even laughed under their breath, shaking their heads at the irony. Amina stood silently, her calm presence making her father's words crumble even more. Every time he tried to speak, his voice faltered. His once commanding tone sounded thin, almost desperate. Her brothers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their pride suddenly overshadowed. For years, they had been celebrated as the successful one. Now, their sister's achievement had swallowed their shine in one night. Chief Tund rubbed his forehead, his igbata suddenly feeling heavy on his shoulders. His eyes darted around the room, but everywhere he looked, he saw admiration directed not at him, not at his sons, but at the daughter he had mocked endlessly. The daughter he had told would die poor. His mouth opened again, but no words came. He tried to force a smile, but it looked strained, awkward. His pride had always been his armor, yet now that armor was cracked beyond repair. And in the middle of it all stood Amina, calm, steady, graceful. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to boast. The truth was already shining too brightly for anyone to ignore. For the first time in her life, it was her father who sat small in the room, while she stood taller than anyone else. The silence in the room stretched until it felt almost unbearable. Amina still held the folder against her chest, her chin lifted, her eyes steady on her father. For years she had swallowed his insults, cried in private, and walked away in silence. But tonight, something inside her rose higher than fear. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice calm but powerful. "Yes, I failed many times. I started things that didn't work. I lost money. I made mistakes. But do you know what those failures gave me? Strength, lessons, patience. Every failure was preparing me for this moment." The room was so quiet that even the sound of her breath seemed loud. Nobody moved. Chief Tund's face was stiff, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't interrupt. Amina's voice grew firmer. "All these years, you called me useless. You laughed at me. You told everyone I would die poor. But your words did not break me. They fueled me. Every insult made me work harder. Every mockery gave me fire. You thought you were crushing me, but you were pushing me to fight." Gasps rippled across the room. Her brothers shifted uneasily, their their heads lowered. For the first time, they didn't feel like the shining stars of the family. Their sister, the one they had mocked, was now standing taller than all of them combined. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, pride shining quietly. Relatives who had once laughed at Amina now sat with guilty faces, unable to meet her gaze. The same people who had made her feel so small now looked smaller themselves. She stepped closer to her father, her tone still calm but carrying the weight of truth. "You thought I was nothing, but look at me now. Look at what your so-called useless daughter has achieved. I didn't let your words define me. I chose my own path, and I succeeded." The words landed heavy, like stones dropped into still water. Chief Tund opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time, his authority crumbled under the voice of his daughter. Amina turned slowly, her eyes sweeping across the room. "To everyone here," she said, "let this be a lesson. Never laugh at someone's struggle. Never mock their dreams. Failure is not the end, it is a teacher. I stand here today not because I never failed, but because I refused to give up." The shift in the air was undeniable. The room that had once echoed with laughter at her expense now held only respect. Heads bowed slightly, eyes softened. Whispers carried not mockery but admiration. Amina didn't shout. She didn't boast. She spoke like a woman who had walked through fire and come out shining. And in that moment, every single person in the room knew the truth. She was no longer the poor dreamer. She was the strongest among them all. Amina stood in the center of the room for a moment longer, letting her words sink into every corner of the house where she had once been ridiculed. Then, without waiting for applause or approval, she closed the folder, held it firmly in her hand, and walked toward the door. Her steps were slow, graceful, full of dignity. Nobody dared to laugh this time. Nobody dared to stop her. The same people who once mocked her now followed her with quiet, humbled eyes. Outside, the night air felt cool against her skin. She lifted her face to the sky and breathed deeply, as though finally free. The contract in her hand wasn't just paper. It was proof of everything she had fought for, everything she had survived. Weeks later, the city buzzed with the news. Amina, the girl who had once hawked Puff Puff in traffic, now owned a grand mansion in one of Lagos's finest estates. White walls, tall gates, and a garden filled with flowers greeted her every morning. But more than the beauty of the house, it was the symbol that mattered. She had built her life on her own terms, with no handouts, no shortcuts, no father's approval. One evening, as she sat by the wide glass windows of her new home, she thought about her journey. The pain, the failures, the cruel words, the tears. All of it had shaped her into the woman she had become. And in that quiet moment, she understood something deeply. True wealth was never just about money. It was about believing in yourself when no one else did, about rising after every fall, about refusing to let the world tell you who you are. That, she realized, was her greatest victory.